Ever wondered what you could do with an old sleeping bag? Well, today I'm going to show you how to upcycle it into a one-of-a-kind puffer jacket. This is a full sewing tutorial, and if you want to make this jacket, I have my pattern linked below. I would say it's more for an intermediate level sewer, but if you're an ambitious beginner, please feel free to follow along. Without further ado, let's just jump right in. After printing the pattern and taping together, to help stay organized, I highly recommend you color code your different layers. Essentially, you have 3 types of fabric and interfacing. This includes the main shell, which is the sleeping bag, contrast, and lining. I used highlighters to organize them. I also highlighted important markings in my size, like the hole punches and notches. You could use an awl or a hole punch to make a hole. I have similar tools linked below. Now it's time to choose your main shell fabric. I encourage you to upcycle an old sleeping bag, but if you don't have one, you could always get quilted fabric or quilt fabric yourself as well. Some other supplies you need are a contrast fabric. I'm using corduroy, but any sturdy material will do. Then you'll need some lining fabric, interfacing, one 24-inch separating zipper, 1/8 inch elastic cording, 2 double hole cord stoppers, 1¼ inch elastic, 4 sets of eyelets in size 1/4 inch, since that's all I had, but you could definitely go smaller. I'm making 2 jackets, hence the 2 colorways, so if I switch between colors, that is why. Some of these trims are optional, which I'll go through later. If you're using a sleeping bag, you want to take it apart so it lays flat. I'm also taking out the zipper. The zipper was pretty damaged to save, but at least I tried. Once you lay out the sleeping bag, you could cut out all the shell pattern pieces. This took me a while since I wanted to cut 2 jackets and match the pattern. Don't forget to mark any hole punches. I'm using an erasable marking pen. If you're using a contrast like corduroy, remember that it has a nap and it's a one-way fabric. I just double check by running my hands on it. The smooth way is always pointing down. Make sure to flip any pattern pieces from top to bottom when using this type of fabric. After attaching the interfacing to the welt facing, on the interfacing side, mark the 2 punch holes. Then draw the rectangle window by connecting the 2 dots, then the short sides 1/2 inch away from the dots. Finishing with the long sides by marking 5/16 inch away from the center line, making it a total of 5/8 inch by 6 inch window. Now that we have all of our pattern pieces cut out, I do want to go over some optional elements to this pattern. First up is a hanging loop. This is added to the jacket if you want to hang it on a coat hanger, and there's no pattern piece to this. It's simply a rectangle that's 1.5 inches wide by 4 inches long, so if you want to add it, please cut at this time. First up is the back neck facing. This is to hold your label and just add a little design element to the inside of the jacket, so it's totally optional. The next one is the zipper guard. This is to protect your skin from the zipper, as well as add some blockage from any wind that would seep in through the zipper, so this is optional to take out as well. And the last ones are the yokes. This just adds a design element to the exterior of the jacket, so you could add or take out. I think it's really nice because it matches the pocket openings, but you do you decide whatever you want for your jacket. So next up, let's dive into sewing. We are going to start with the pockets. Take the welt facing with the window you just drew and poke a hole through the punch holes. With right sides together, line the holes with the markings on the front body and pin. Stitch the window using the markings as a guide. Overlap the previous stitch about 1 inch. Using the holes in the facing, carefully cut through all layers the center line, pivoting at the punch holes to each corner, making triangles. Cut as close as possible to the corners without going through the stitches. Edge stitch the long sides of the window on the right side of the facing and flip inside the body and press. Now take your small and big pocket bag and line them up from the curved side. There should be a gap on the straight edge. Sew the curved side starting and stopping about 2 inches from each end. Make sure you back tack and that these pieces are mirrored. Take the welt piece and iron in half. Sew to the inside of the small pocket bag at 1/4 inch, then press the seams towards the curved side and edge stitch. Take the welt piece to the inside of the body and line it up to the long side closest to the side seam. The big pocket bag is on top. Make sure to butt up the welt to the window while not going over the opening. Pin the welt in place at the top and bottom, making sure the big pocket bag is flipped out of the way. Now flip to the right side of the body with the big pocket bag bag flipped away. Edge stitch starting from the bottom up the long side closest to the center front and stopping at the top of the window before the short sides. Making sure the needle is all the way up, carefully tuck back the big pocket bag in place so it's laying flat and lined up with the welt facing. Take a ruler to tug the bobbin thread long enough to create a loop to flip the big pocket bag flat. Insert the needle back into the last stitch hole. You may need to carefully tug on the top thread to prevent any loops on the right side of the body. Continue sewing on the top short side and stitching back and forth 3 times to make the edges strong. Then continue back down the other long side and going over the bottom of the window 2 more times, making it a total of 3 passes at the bottom. From the inside, you should only see stitches of half the window and a loop that you made with the bobbin thread. Do not cut this thread. Then you are going to finish up the pocket by closing up the top and bottom of the pocket bags and overlapping the previous stitch about an inch. Repeat to the other side. Add the yokes to the shell by ironing under the seam allowance and lining it up with the notches and pin. Edge stitch it down. Then add an optional top stitch at a 1/4 inch. Repeat to the back yoke. Also at this time, I suggest you sew the layers together around all shell body pieces within the seam allowance. This will make sewing the pieces together smoother since all the layers will be intact. Now join the shell body at the shoulders, the sleeves at the armhole, and close up the side seams by starting at the inseam of the sleeves to the bottom of the jacket. Then add the collar to the neckline. Before we attach the cuff, you want to determine how big you want your sleeve opening. You could customize it however you like. I cut my elastic to be 8 inches with a 1/2 inch seam allowance because I like a little scrunch at the cuff, but you can make it looser or tighter however you like, but determine how big you want your sleeve opening, sew a loop, and then we'll attach the cuff. Sew the side seam of the cuff and mark the middle of the fold line. Then take the elastic loop and line it up with the mark. Make sure the seams are open to distribute the bulk. Tack 4 to 5 inches in the ditch from the right side. It makes a much neater tack since no one cares what the inside looks like. Close up the cuff by sewing within the seam allowance. This will make it easier to join with the sleeves later. Gently stretch the elastic as you sew. Sew cuff to sleeve opening by lining up the inseam to the seam of the cuff. If you have clips, this could help you hold the pieces together. I didn't, but I just went slow, double checking every so often that I'm catching all the layers. Changing to a narrow foot like a zipper foot and a bigger needle helped me tackle the bulk. Assemble the back neck label facing by marking the center and attaching your label. Then make the hanging loop by ironing in a 1/4 inch each side and then in half enclosing all the seams. Then edge stitch. Tack down the loop within seam allowance by placing each end 3/4 of an inch from the center back. Then stitch a guideline 1/16 inch shy of the seam allowance and clip the curves as close to the stitch line but not through it. Iron under the seam allowance and pin to the back neck lining and edge stitch. Sew the rest of the lining in the same order as the shell, starting with the shoulders then the armholes. The side seams are the same except on the wearer's left side, leave a 8 to 10 inch window on the inseam of the sleeve. This is very important so you could turn the jacket inside out. Finish the lining by attaching the collar. Now we could insert the zipper to our shell. Take the center front of the jacket and mark out the 1/2 inch seam allowance at the collar and the 1.5 inch hem allowance. Center the zipper within those marks. Aim for an 1/8 inch to a 1/4 inch gap from the top of the finished collar. My zipper was a little short, so I just made sure to line it more to the top than the bottom. Using a zipper foot, separate the zipper and sew to one side of the center front. Zip back to the other side of the zipper and mark guidelines for the collar, yoke line, and any other design lines you want to match. Then unzip and attach it to the other side using those guidelines. Double check that all the design lines match up before moving on. To add the zipper guard, fold lengthwise and sew the seam allowance at the short sides. You could trim the bulky seams before flipping right side out and press. You could add an optional top stitch to make it more sturdy. I used a 1/4 inch. Insert the zipper guard by lining it up to the wearer's left side of the body. The guard should slightly be above the zipper pull and then mark. With right side to right side, sew within the seam allowance to hold in place. Next up, we're going to be inserting all the eyelets. Before that, you want to back them them up with some type of interfacing. Go ahead and test your shell fabric to see what kind of interfacing you want to use. I'm going to be using iron-on because I tested mine and it didn't melt, but if you're using a sleeping bag, most likely it's synthetic and it will. So you want to use sew-in instead. So go ahead and cut some 1.5 inch squares after testing your fabric, and then we're going to insert the eyelets. After ironing on the interfacing for the eyelets, I'm remarking the punch holes since they erase, but for the sew-in, just place them underneath before adding them. Before inserting the eyelets, I like to take some of that bulk out with some type of punch hole. This will make the application of the eyelets easier and neater. Now add the eyelets according to your kit or machine of choice. I'm using an industrial press. Before adding the elastic cording, determine how long you want it to be. I made mine 4 inches longer than the bottom opening, so I have a little loop on each side to adjust the bottom. I cut around 50 inches for the small medium size. Take the elastic cording through the first eyelet on the front body and insert it up to the first hole of the cord stopper, then down the other side making a loop. Now insert to the back body eyelet and repeat to the other side. Tack down the ends of the cording to the center front of the jacket. Center it on the hem allowance, then sew a few stitches back and forth to secure it in place. To attach the lining, we are going to start with the cuff. Pin right side of shell collar to right side of lining collar. Line up the sleeves on each side so both the shell and the lining inseams are pointing down and are aligned. Take the inside of the lining inseam and the inseam of the cuff seam and kiss the sleeves together, making them right sides together. Make sure not to twist the sleeves. Once they are aligned properly, sew around the sleeve opening through all layers. This can get a little bulky, so I suggest you changing to a zipper foot and a thicker needle. If your sleeve opening got a little smaller due to the bulk, I suggest sewing with the lining on the bottom to feed in the lining evenly. Once both sleeve openings are sewn correctly, you can now close the bottom of the jacket at 1/2 inch seam allowance. Be mindful of the cord so you don't accidentally sew through it. Next, pin up the rest of the seam allowance at 1 inch and pin in place, starting at the hem up the center front and around to the collar to the other side, and sew. Trim the corners and some bulk in the collar so it's easier to turn inside out. Pop the collars inside enough so you could join the two collars together at the neckline. Sew between the shoulder seams within the seam allowance to join together. This will help the collar stay intact when wearing the jacket. To turn the jacket inside out, go through the lining hole and find a sleeve that's on the other side. Then gently pull through until everything is right side out. To create the hem tunnel for the cording, pin up 1 inch and pull the pocket bags out so you don't accidentally sew them. Then top stitch. I like to top stitch from the shell layer to distribute the bulk evenly, and this will also hide any not so perfect stitches to the inside. One last thing you want to do is add a 1/4 inch top stitch to each side of the zipper. This will prevent the lining rolling into the zipper and getting caught. The final thing you want to do now is to close up the lining sleeve opening by edge stitching it closed. I hope this inspires you to turn your old sleeping bag into a unique one-of-a-kind piece. If you do end up making this jacket, please tag me. I'd love to see your creations. Not into DIY, no worries. Both of these jackets will be available on my website for purchase. Don't forget to subscribe for more behind the scenes of running a small handmade clothing business, sewing content, and tutorials. Also connect with me on my socials to see what I'm currently making. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys soon. Bye.